Now, I don't believe in a lot of things, but one thing I passionately believe is that a steak like this one that I'm holding in my hands right now, a steak like this could save the world. It can help fight climate change, it can feed millions of people, it can enrich our soils, and it can preserve and protect water. All of these benefits coming from humble steaks like the one I hold in my hand. Allow me to explain. Release the Kraken! Good morning, Duckery dudes. How's everybody doing this morning? So last night I found myself online and engaging in a comment argument with a bunch of people online, as I often stupidly do. And the debate and discussion was centered on this idea that stopping beef and stopping people from eating beef and dairy and other cow-based food products would actually have a major positive impact on the world. And you know, in some ways, they're kind of right. Conventionally raised beef and conventionally raised dairy are really responsible for some awful things ecologically speaking. You know, high methane production, the ruining of our waterways, massive carbon footprints. You know, when you look at the world's beef consumption habits, and even meat consumption habits in general, I absolutely can appreciate the argument that a lot of folks will put out there against eating meat and against eating beef specifically. Good morning, chickens and geese. Come on out and enjoy the fresh air. It's a beautiful day outside. It's about 20 degrees or so and really nice out there. Come on, geese. I know I can at least convince you guys to go outside. Let's go. They're curious about it, but they're not rushing right out there just yet. What do you say, guys? You want to come out? Yay, fresh air. It's so nice and warm in that hoop house that sometimes they don't want to come outside. Hey there, silky chickens. How are you doing? I mean, to state my case on this topic, look, I will be the first to acknowledge that feedlot conditions for cattle and beef production are absolutely abysmal. And the practices of conventional dairy aren't really any better either. You know, typically what's happening in the beef feedlot production here in the United States, they have a large number of animals concentrated in a small space, and they're feeding them corn and other grains as a way to fatten them up for slaughter. Number one, that's pretty terrible for the animals. They don't actually get to be cattle and do the things that cattle do. They just are big old meat pods that are kept in a place. And I think it's actually an awful way to raise an animal. Furthermore, you know, their diet is not consisting of what cattle were actually raised to eat. You know, historically, cattle have been grazers. You know, cattle are ruminants. That means that they take grasses and they eat them up, and through a specially evolved system of stomachs and digestive tracts, they're actually able to turn grass that just grows out on the ground into a worthwhile food that can fuel them and grow them into massive large beasts. You know, obviously there's all sorts of different herbivores around the world, although thanks to us humans there's a lot fewer of them. And if you look at any good, healthy, thriving ecosystem, the landscape always has herbivores in the mix as part of its inhabitants. They play a super important role in the ecosystem. But with feedlot production, man, you're not treating them like ruminants, you're treating them like meat pods. So you have all this concentrated manure, which becomes a risk for your waterways, and you have a ton of methane production concentrated in one small space, which just absolutely amplifies the negative impact of methane and is a big driver of climate change. And then to top it all off, you have to leverage countless acres of farmland to grow the grain and corns that you're going to ultimately feed the cattle. And then you have to use fossil fuels to get the grains and the corn and whatever to the cattle themselves so that they can consume it. And then you have to use fossil fuels again to remove all the manure. Clearly that system doesn't make sense from an ecological perspective, but we have gravitated to it as a society because it's how you can produce cheaper, more affordable beef. And when folks come to the defense of feedlots, they often say, well, that's the only way you're going to feed everybody. But I personally believe that there can be a different way of approaching things. So let me just say in this video that I, with no uncertain terms, believe that feedlot production beef is absolutely abysmal for the planet, and it is not how we should be producing food, nor is it how we as consumers should be consuming it. But let's talk about something known as rotational grazing. And for those of you guys who are not familiar, rotational grazing is the concept of having various herbivores and ruminants in paddocks and and you move them quickly across the landscape where they might graze a small portion of grass heavily for a day and then move on to another paddock. You do this day after day after day, and what that does is it rapidly consumes a lot of grass in one small spot, but then you leave that space to rest for probably about 2 months or so, sometimes even more. And when you do this has a lot of positive impacts. Number one, you're evenly distributing the manure of the animals across the pasture, and you're doing it in a way where you're actually fertilizing that pasture and making that pasture much more productive, where you can actually support more animals on a smaller piece of land. And then in addition to that, a University of Louisiana study suggests that by rotationally grazing and moving your animals onto fresh pasture on a regular and frequent basis, it also significantly reduces methane emissions. And then when you talk about that carbon footprint that comes from having to truck in food from farmland, that's also completely reduced, because essentially you're moving the cattle to the food versus moving the food to the cattle. So this system all kind of makes sense, right? And to be honest, the system isn't that much different than what happens in nature. Like I said earlier, typical natural ecosystems, they often rely on having large herbivores going through and creating that grazing down and then moving forward. The way it would work in nature is you typically have packs of predators that are pursuing them. Like picture wolves and bison out in the open United States prairie going back, say, 500-600 years ago. You know, the bison would come through, they would ravage one specific spot, eat it all down, and then once they were done with that, they'd move on to the next space because they typically had a pack of wolves that were looking for their sickest and weakest animals to eat. While it might not seem symbiotic, that relationship between the wolf and the bison is how you maintain a healthy ecosystem. And so while those two groups of animals had a very adversarial relationship, on behalf of the ecosystem it was quite symbiotic. You know, as a farmer, what I'm doing is I'm using lightweight electric fencing and using that to move my animals along the pasture.
Don't whiz on the electric fence.
The electric fence essentially mimics the movement of the predator and keeps that herbivore moving. Now, this type of system doesn't just apply to cattle. It also goes for other ruminants like sheep. And even though they're not technically ruminants, I've also been managing systems like this with geese, because geese get most of their diet from eating grass as well. And so I truly believe that this system of having grass-based meats is good for the planet. Now, I will say though that this does not apply to other types of meats. You know, for example, pork and chicken and duck, those animals in most farming systems typically require a lot of grain inputs. And even here on our farm, we feed our chickens and ducks a lot of grains. And I will be the first to admit that that has a much greater negative impact on the ecosystem. But I see the goal as trying to get better and better, not perfect. The role that things like pigs and chickens and ducks play in the ecosystem has a benefit as well. You know, pigs are great disruptors of an ecosystem. They're turning over soil and rooting and destroying. That destruction actually creates opportunity for new growth and keeps an ecosystem from becoming stagnant. Meanwhile, ducks are great for controlling noxious weeds as well as insects, and chickens are good for eating insects as well, and they're also great for decomposing and breaking down various things on the pasture. So for example, this summer, we're gonna have a flock of chickens that follows our cattle as we move them through the pasture. Those chickens are gonna pick and root through the cow pies and spread the manure even more. And they're also gonna eat the fly larvae that exists in here. You know, a big part of how we're trying to run this farm is create an ecosystem. You know, even down to our barn cats that you see ranging around here. Because the birds spread so much of their grain on the ground, that attracts rodents. Those rodents are feed for things like coyotes and bobcats and foxes. The barn cats manage the rodent population, which helps keep our farm cleaner as well as keep the predators away. And as I give this spiel, I always have to recognize my buddy Toby Dog here. He also helps keep the predators away by being the biggest, most apex predator we could possibly have. Yes, that's right. Yes, that's right. You know, another ecological knock that I hear about cattle and their impact on the environment is the amount of water that it takes with them. Yes, cattle do drink a lot of water. You know, relatively speaking, it's probably more than watering certain crops like soybeans. But you also have to recognize that that also depends on how you're managing your animals as well. If you're raising them in an ultra hot climate or a desert climate, that actually becomes more of a tax. Or if you're raising them here in an environment like Vermont, where we have a lot of rainfall that comes on an annual basis, as well as a lot of moisture that comes from the snow that covers our ground. And so the use of water is less problematic. And on top of it all, actually having cattle out there grazing the pasture and moving on and doing those rotational grazing systems helps make your land more drought resistant. Because when your cattle poop on the pasture, what they're doing is depositing a lot of chemicals in the form of like nitrogen and other things. Those chemicals become fertilizer for the future. But then on top of it all, what you're also going to find happening is that they're depositing organic matter that helps make the soil more absorbent and more drought resistant. See that right there? That is fertilizer. Geese add a lot of fertilizer too, even in the cold winter months. You know, if you talk to ranchers like Greg Judy down in Missouri, he can show you example after example of how his system of grazing animals has made that land much more drought resistant than neighbors that are using conventional methods or that they're simply just haying their pastures. You know, even down the road, my buddy Zach, who's been grazing sheep on his pastures for a couple of years now, you can just see it as you drive by on a dry August afternoon where a lot of the hay fields in the area are starting to turn brown, and his stuff just looks lush and green from all of that activity and all of that organic matter. Now, there's some folks out there who will argue that you shouldn't be eating animals just because animals are other creatures. I don't put myself in that category. If you choose not to eat meat because that's your personal belief that you don't think it's right to eat an animal, I actually support that, and I think that that makes perfect sense. And yeah, you shouldn't eat meat. I personally believe differently because if I look at the broader landscape and I look at the animal kingdom that we exist in, whether it's a wild ecosystem or a man-made ecosystem, you need animals working together to produce food. And sometimes that food production and that energy transfer comes in the form of one animal eating another animal. Whether that's a bird eating a worm, or a bobcat eating a mouse, or a person eating a steak, it's part of the circle of life. And in fact, even people who think about going to focus on like corn and wheat and soy, things that you can grow to eat, you have to recognize that there's an animal cost even in that activity. Whether it's the destruction of habitat to till up fields, or even if you're doing a no-till system, the lack of biodiversity kills a lot of living creatures. Meanwhile, if you compare that to the biodiversity of an open pasture, it's an incredible difference. And then the other aspect is to grow those food crops like corn or wheat or soy or quinoa or whatever you want to try to grow, you need fertilizers to actually be able to create an ongoing cycle of production. And you need animals to produce that fertilizer. And if you have animals producing fertilizer, you're going to have to come up with a way to manage the numbers of those animals. So even if you're a vegan or a vegetarian, to get you food, it's generally speaking going to cost animal lives. And those activities are going to have some sort of carbon footprint. You know, just the other night I was looking at a study that talked about the total net of greenhouse gas emissions per pound of finished food product. You know, when you compare things like conventional beef, Beyond Burger, and Impossible Burger, clearly Beyond Burger and Impossible Burger have less greenhouse gas emissions per finished pound. But if you look at a grass-fed, grass-finished pound of beef, what you're gonna find is it has a total net greenhouse gas emission of negative 3.5 per pound of meat. That's right, negative. You know, because back again to what I was saying earlier about that process of growing grass and then grazing grass, that cycle of activity, what that's doing is, as the grass grows, it brings in carbon. That carbon then gets sequestered in the earth. The frequent cycle of growth and then destruction and then regrowth, that ultimately leads to that carbon sequestration. And that's why grass-fed, grass-finished beef can actually be carbon negative. Now, none of this is to say that any system is perfect. I mean, even here on our farm where I'm learning how to do my own rotational grazing system, I'm not very happy with how I handle the cattle in winter. I mean, I essentially constructed a lot and I use greenhouse gases to bring in hay to feed them. And even though this hay is only from about a mile away, that's more of a land impact that I'd like. And I have to wrap said hay in plastic, which is also a real negative and a waste. But I have plans to get better and make this operation even more sustainable. And so I'm trying. It's not easy and it doesn't happen automatically, but I believe with a little bit of effort and a little bit of experimentation, I'll be able to get to a system that is acceptable exceptionally sustainable. And then if you look at the goose meat and the beef that would be produced from our farm, it'd be super sustainable. You know, the other major argument that comes up that folks will make about doing a pasture-based meat system is that it costs too much. There are too many people in this world who are hungry, and your meat production is much too expensive. And to that, what I would say is that I think we as a society eat way too much daggone meat in the first place. And if you thought a little less conventionally about how you manage pasture land and how you treated open grazing, you could find a lot more grazing space for animals like cattle, or probably more easily things like goats and sheep. You know, imagine if every front lawn and every golf course was turned into grazing land for sheep. I mean, you could still have it as your front lawn and you could still play golf around that pasture. You just might need to dance around a couple of sheep turds. But ultimately, that means a lot more untapped land. And that would mean a lot more untapped land that would be sequestering carbon. And so by moving to eating meat maybe only 5 or 6 meals per week, using more unconventional cuts of an animal, and using more unconventional places for grazing, both your cost and your demand for meat production goes down significantly. And this is where I get into the frustrating bad faith argument I feel like that often comes from vegans who argue against meat in the name of climate change. Because I so often feel like they're making that argument in a way where they're not considering potential opportunities to use animals to help the climate. And like I said earlier, if they're against eating meat because they're against eating animals in general, okay, that's fine, that's their personal choice and I respect it. But if they're arguing it solely on climate change grounds, I think they are missing significant opportunities to actually make a positive impact. But I guess the polarized nature of our society is always going to lead to this us versus them mentality in terms of solving problems, when I think ultimately we need to be working together to solve them.